Before dawn on October 24, 1944, the men of Task Group 38.3, flying the new generation of fast carrier power into the heart of the Pacific, were already talking quietly on darkened flight decks about fuel loads, sortie counts, and how many flights Princeton's small hull could squeeze out before midday. A little-known detail often missed in modern retellings is this. The Independence-class light carriers were not purpose-built carriers. They were Cleveland-class light cruisers, reskinned, replated, and accelerated into carrier service because the Navy needed flight decks faster than shipyards could produce Essex hulls. That hybrid DNA mattered. It meant tight fuel corridors, compact aviation spaces, and damage control teams who knew they were operating on a vessel that had hull bones never originally designed to sustain aviation fires. This documentary begins with that reality. USS Princeton, CVL-23, entering the most important convergence of fleets the Pacific had yet seen, with structural strengths and weaknesses baked into her steel. Her pilots and ordnance crews had been briefed. Luzon airfields. Stripped the Japanese of land-based search and strike capability. Task Force 38 was operating as the airhammer to MacArthur's strategic promise, "I shall return." Princeton, assigned to TG 38.3 under Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, had launched sorties already. But this day was different. This day was the beginning of the largest naval battle in recorded history, Leyte Gulf, a 4-day chain reaction of engagements in 4 separate quadrants of the sea: Surigao Strait, Sibuyan Sea, Cape Engano, and the approaches to Leyte itself. What no one fully understood in real time is that Japanese naval air was not dead. It was fractured, scattered, rationing fuel, but not dead. And as Princeton's pilots climbed into the morning sky, the weather in that sector was not fully cooperative. Broken cloud layers over Luzon meant radar returns came and went. Picket destroyers like USS Morrison, DD 560, reported contacts 1 minute, nothing the next. For the operational commanders making decisions on the flag bridge of carriers like Essex, Lexington, and Princeton, the air picture was filled with ghosts. Real aircraft, false echoes, interference, and distant clutter. But if there was tension on the bridge, there was even more tension on the hangar deck. Aviation ordnance crews were handling 500-pound GP bombs, fuses, and drop tanks in a space barely large enough to shoulder through. A Princeton avionics rating later wrote that the light carrier's belly felt like operating a small airport inside a broom closet. There was no excess volume. The ship was a combat machine relentlessly optimized for launching aircraft, while sacrificing, by sheer geometry, survivability margins. And her captain knew this. Captain William H. Buraker, Naval Academy, class of 1916, was stern, methodical, and not interested in poetic speeches. His mission was numbers. Sorties per hour. Bomb tonnage on target. Strike cycles. Princeton was the lean predator of the task group, small, fast, and lethal. But she was also carrying volatile aviation gasoline through piping that threaded below her hangar deck in tight runs. A single blast, if it penetrated below the flight deck, could reach vapor pockets nobody could extinguish fast enough. The human paradox on this morning is chilling. The men aboard Princeton had total confidence in their ability to kill the enemy. Their confidence in their ability to survive a catastrophic hit, however, was not the same as those aboard Essex or Intrepid. Still, morale was good. The war was shifting. The soldiers ashore in Leyte, wading through surf, could feel the return of American air dominance overhead. But above Luzon, somewhere, streaking through scattered cumulus, Japanese Navy pilots were still hunting, independently, opportunistically, taking any gap in American coverage as permission to attack. Later interviews with aviators who flew from TG 38.3 that week suggest that the fleet was fighting faster than its ability to emotionally process losses. The scale of the war, the distances, were so vast that when carriers were hit, they seemed to disappear from the map with a kind of disorienting abruptness. And this is where the story of Princeton becomes uniquely unsettling. She would be one of those ships. The narrative tension starts here, in the pre-impact moment, because this part of the Pacific War is filled with future ghosts. Screens were lit with ambiguous radar returns. Lookouts saw flashes but could not determine altitude. Pilots reported stray shadows on their periphery. Something was coming. A single enemy aircraft. A single bomb. A single moment that would start a chain reaction nobody on Princeton could reverse. And as the morning advanced, the men aboard this light carrier had no idea that their ship, which began the day launching aircraft like any other fast carrier morning, would not survive the next several hours. In after-action interviews, carrier aviators often describe the Pacific sky as crowded with information but starved of clarity. On October 24, 1944, that concept becomes visceral reality. Task Group 38.3's radar picture over Luzon was littered with intermittent returns. And yet, the most decisive aircraft of the next 4 hours, a single Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber from the 601st Air Group, was not detected in a way that triggered decisive interception. That is not myth. That is not dramatic reinterpretation. That is simply how fast the Pacific could turn lethal. A single airframe, against the most modern carrier task force ever assembled, could still punch through. The tension is this: Princeton was not alone. She was operating under the umbrella of the most formidable naval strike force in human history. Enterprise, Essex, Lexington, Langley, San Jacinto, Below Wood, Steel City of carriers. And yet, Princeton's position, her timing, the way her flight deck configuration forced her to maintain certain headings during launch and recovery. All of that combined to expose one narrow vulnerability window. Sometime late that morning, the Judy, likely flown by Lieutenant Tominaga Nobuo or another experienced 601st pilot, approached from altitude, outside the angle that USN radar operators were prioritizing. American fighter direction officers were tracking larger raid blobs further north. The Judy was not a massed raid. It was a single, well-flown interloper hidden in the noise of scattered cloud and ground clutter. On Princeton's flight deck, ordnance crews and yellow shirts were hip-deep in another recovery cycle. One of the oddities of the Independence class was how crowded its aft deck zones became when aircraft were spotted tight for res-potting and refueling. Eyewitness accounts note that Princeton was in a tactical phase of reordering aircraft positions, compressing some, shifting others, when the Judy entered its dive. There is a tiny detail here that gives this moment its knife-edge tension. Princeton's gunners did fire. But they fired late, and from suboptimal angles, because the Judy came in almost directly out of the sun's reflective shield through a fractured cloud layer. There is no suggestion in primary sources that Princeton was slack or undermanned. This was simply, tragically, the Pacific's version of perfect timing. At 10:09 a.m., the Judy dropped a single 250-kilogram bomb. It did not explode on deck. It punched through the flight deck aft of the island, then detonated in the hangar. And that fact is the entire hinge of the Princeton story. A flight deck detonation would have been bad, but containable. Intermediate deck penetration into aviation gasoline handling lines was catastrophic. Flames in the hangar raced forward and downward, not outward. Fire crews, trained and disciplined, ran into smoke that was already black, oily, and superheated. They were fighting not a fire, but a chemical process, flashing atomized fuel in a space built from a cruiser's inherited hull geometry. Princeton's compartmentalization was never designed for burning aviation gasoline. Within minutes, the ship's command structure understood the situation was not stable. Captain Bureker's combat narrative to Admiral Sherman's flagship is short, blunt, devastating. Fires gaining. Request immediate assistance. And this is where the human component shifts. The attack itself, the bomb, is visible, cinematic. But the deeper horror here is in the invisible machinery of layered failure. Princeton was not destroyed by a bomb. She was destroyed by what the bomb triggered, the ignition of aviation gas fumes in spaces where firefighting lines could not be safely manned. Meanwhile, radar operators on destroyer pickets were reporting new phantom returns, but none correlated to the original attacker. The Judy had slipped out of the narrative entirely. The attacker leaves the frame, and the ship begins to die without him. Princeton's crew fought relentlessly. Fire mains were opened. Foam lines were run. But the heat curve in the aft magazines was rising. And the tactical picture around the task group was still unstable. More strikes were still being pushed toward Luzon. Princeton was beginning to fall out of the battle while the battle was still expanding. By midday, Task Group 38.3 had a wounded ship in its center. The Pacific's greatest naval offensive could not pause to babysit a burning light carrier, but it could not abandon her either. And the worst had not yet happened. The arrival of help, in Princeton's case, did not feel like rescue. It felt like a gathering tension. Several ships in Task Group 38.3 began maneuvering to support the wounded light carrier. Destroyers like USS Irwin, DD 794, and USS Morrison, and most notably, the heavy cruiser USS Birmingham, CL 62. Birmingham had the size, pumps, and trained repair parties to meaningfully augment Princeton's exhausted damage control teams. But to close with a burning carrier in wartime conditions was to accept severe danger by default. Historians often treat the next hours as inevitable, as if Princeton was already doomed, but contemporary testimony doesn't read like men acting under fatalism. Birmingham's crew thought they could save her. When Birmingham slid alongside Princeton, fenders and lines in place, the sea between them churned with foam and smoke. The two ship silhouettes, side by side, look almost unreal in photographs, because both were now stationary relative to the battle environment while naval aviation duels continued overhead. Admiral Sherman's flagship had ongoing strike sequencing. Pilots were still being vectored to Luzon. And yet, in the center of the most powerful carrier battle ever fought, two steel hulls were stopped in the water, connected by hoses and ladders, fighting not the enemy, but time. Princeton's internal temperatures were somewhere around a threshold that no Navy officer wants to say out loud while a ship is still technically recoverable. Forward ordnance rooms were inaccessible. The light carrier's aft magazine, where torpedo warheads were stored, was the true threat. Torpedo warheads do not merely detonate. They create shock impulses that ripple through steel. Damage control logs remaining from this period note that firefighting lines were run directly into smoke so dark it was nearly sensory deprivation. Princeton's fire was burning in spaces so enclosed that we were not putting water onto fire, we were putting water into heat, as one sailor later described it. Water would flash into steam in bursts visible from outside ventilation grills. Birmingham's captain, Thomas Inglis, later wrote that he considered several alternatives. Try to flood Princeton's aft magazines intentionally, cut loose and pull off further, or break contact entirely. But the standing logic remained: if the magazine did not cook off, Princeton might still survive long enough to be towed, or at least to delay final loss. This is the knife-edge moment in the Princeton narrative. At roughly 1523, events jump from stabilizing crisis to irreversible cascade. The aft torpedo magazine detonated. One eyewitness on Birmingham's port side said the blast was like a city block erupting. Princeton's stern essentially disappeared. Birmingham's upper decks, lined with gunners, repair parties, medical personnel, were shredded in a single instant. Over 200 Birmingham sailors were killed in seconds. Bodies, fragment bursts of deck plating, flaming wreckage, all thrown in arcs across both ship structures. The shockwave traveled along Princeton's keel, snapping structural continuity and making any meaningful internal salvage impossible. Birmingham herself, the rescuer, was now badly wounded. This is the cruel geometry of the moment. The explosion did not kill only the ship that had been bombed. It killed the ship that had approached to save it. From this point forward, the nature of the Princeton disaster becomes something different, less like conventional battle damage and more like a kind of maritime vanishing act. After the detonation, Princeton no longer looked like a ship with a fire. She looked like a ship in the process of ceasing to exist. Survivors on both sides describe a surreal silence after the thunder of the blast. Smoke turned from black to gray. Flames became less bright, because they were now burning into open-air cavities. Princeton's aft third was a skeletal ruin, plating peeled back, nothing left to salvage. Any concept of towing, gone. And there is one last detail often noted in oral histories, a detail that feels like foreshadowing of the eerie disappearance to come. From certain angles, after the blast, you could look straight through Princeton's aft superstructure and see sky. She was not yet gone, but she was already no longer fully there. Birmingham, wounded, began to withdraw. She could not save Princeton anymore. Irwin and Morrison stayed close enough to continue rescuing survivors and prepare for scuttling if ordered. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a battle defined by grand fleet movements, battleship duels, and carrier strike waves, Princeton's fate became something stranger, smaller, and yet far more haunting. One ship, slipping toward absence in slow motion, and the worst part still not complete. When Birmingham pulled clear, Princeton's silhouette was no longer the shape that USN officers recognized as a light carrier. The blast had carved her aft third into open geometry, exposing the ship's interior to the ocean air. And yet, she remained afloat. Afloat, burning, wounded, and stubbornly refusing to sink. In the middle of the largest naval battle in modern history, Task Group 38.3 now had a philosophical crisis to resolve. How do you abandon a carrier that is technically still present, yet tactically dead? Princeton's fires were still alive deep below the hangar deck. Fire control parties and repair crews, those who could still breathe through masks and cloth improvised around their faces, reported temperatures so intense that even armored fitting points rated to retain load integrity at specific thermal limits, were deforming. And the worst piece of this hellscape, damage control teams could no longer get to the last dangerous space aboard, the forward magazine. The light carrier's internal routes, the physical hallways and ducting that once linked compartments, were gone. Not blocked. Gone. In Princeton's Combat Information Center, the reality finally hardened. The ship's internal spatial map, the map sailors memorized from training and drills, was now a lie. A maze erased. Nothing inside corresponded to the blueprints that defined its original structure. An Independence-class light carrier was not designed to take a cruiser-grade shock impulse from itself. And yet, this was the mechanical crime of the bomb. Princeton destroyed Princeton. There are surviving radio logs from adjacent vessels showing the psychological shift. One voice, calm but drained, from Irwin: "She's losing definition. Not burning. Not breaking up. But losing definition. Because that is exactly what was happening." What remained of the flight deck had warped at the aft hull fracture line. The ship's structural rigidity, that invisible internal force that keeps a warship's shape, was bleeding out of her like steam. Now, the task group had to decide: leave Princeton to drift, or send her under. Leaving her was not an option. A flaming carrier was a drifting bullet, a threat to nearby ships, and a radiating smoke signature that could draw more attackers. She had to be scuttled. So destroyers, including Irwin and Morrison, began preparations to do something no American officer ever wanted to do to a U.S. flat-top: sink her deliberately. Naval doctrine was clear: torpedoes were the cleanest method. But here, doctrine met anomaly. Where do you shoot a ship whose volumes are no longer where their plating tells you they are? Where do you aim on a ship that is partly hollow where her blueprints say she is solid? This confusion, this uncertainty, created an eerie moment. There were discussions, short, clipped, about how to place the first torpedo strike so that Princeton would roll and go down cleanly. The goal was physics predictability. America's destroyer captains were trying to, in the middle of war, respect the geometry of a ship that had already lost her shape. But every minute that passed, Princeton's fires continued to eat what remained. Then another unsettling detail, recorded in several survivor accounts, surfaced. The smoke changed again. It thinned. As if Princeton were hollowing out from the inside, like a dying star collapsing after its core has burned through its final fuel. This was not a ship exploding. This was a ship evaporating meaning. A carrier that had begun the day projecting power across hundreds of miles had now become an emptying frame. The destroyer captains finally got their answer. They would fire. But this is where the paradox becomes complete. They would have to aim torpedoes into a ship that no longer behaved like a ship. And in the next phase, the Pacific would erase the remainder of Princeton with a few detonations, and when the smoke cleared, she would not be there. In late afternoon light, October 24, 1944, destroyers maneuvered into firing arcs that no one aboard ever wanted to take. They were not lining up on an enemy. They were lining up on one of their own. USS Princeton, CVL-23, a commissioned U.S. Navy warship, was now the designated target. Irwin and Morrison prepared torpedo tubes. Range officers looked down optics at a carrier that just that morning had been launching strike aircraft into the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, the same carrier's hull was so broken, so internally gutted, that officers had to estimate where displaced buoyancy pockets actually were. You do not train for this. You do not practice sinking a friendly carrier. You hope it will never be required. Yet here, the U.S. Navy had to finish what one Japanese pilot had started with a single 250-kilogram bomb. By this hour, Princeton was a hollowed carcass of plating, wiring, and twisted frame. One torpedo was fired and hit, but the light carrier did not immediately sink. Instead, she seemed to absorb impact. A U.S. destroyer captain later described it as if we put a hole in something that already did not have interior mass. Fires had burned out the guts, the shell still floated. That is the part that still unnerves historians. Princeton had lost form, and yet she still sat on the ocean. While the destroyers maneuvered again, Birmingham, wounded, bleeding from topside casualties, steamed slowly away, trailing smoke. Her casualty lists were already staggering. Men who had stepped onto her decks to help Princeton had paid the highest price. All because she came too close to a ship whose fire profile changed faster than doctrinal estimates. Princeton survivors, those who had been pulled out of the water or rescued off the forward sections of the flight deck, now watched salvors become executioners. These were men who just hours earlier believed their carrier would return to Ulithi, get patched, and then fly again. Now they watched the U.S. Navy, their own Navy, aim weapons into her remaining steel. The decision was not callous. It was tactical necessity. Every carrier in this fleet was a pillar in the air plan. The enemy was not finished. Japanese forces were assembling toward Cape Engano. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was still on a rising curve. Princeton, burning, generating smoke that could act as a beacon, was not only unsavable, she was becoming a risk multiplier. A drifting flaming hull could not be allowed to compromise the safety envelope of a carrier task group. Destroyers repositioned. Another torpedo run was made. This time, the hit triggered the final collapse. Witnesses said Princeton folded into herself. One moment, a ruined shape. The next, a steep angle. Steel plates peeled like tin. Sea took her fast, because internal structure wasn't there to resist. A few seconds of violence, then a sudden stillness. Smoke drifted. Debris floated. Princeton simply wasn't there. This is not myth. This isn't poetic embellishment. In official logs, Princeton transitions from present to sunk in minutes. But the emotional weight, for the men who watched, was different. Ships die in war. But ships rarely go from burning to gone with such abrupt absence of recognizable shape. Survivors said the moment felt less like watching a sinking, and more like watching an erasure. What was left wasn't a sinking hulk but a stain of smoke on calm Pacific water. Some historians, careful, sober, conservative in wording, have noted in commentary that Princeton may be the only U.S. carrier loss in World War II where the moment of loss of physical presence was functionally identical to disappearance. Not because she vanished in mystery, but because combat attrition had eaten her from the inside out before the final torpedoes arrived. And this last fact, in a sober cold way, is the real core of the USS Princeton's last hours. She didn't explode and sink like other wartime carriers. She decomposed, then the U.S. Navy erased the remainder. The destroyers retrieved final survivors. Debris drifted east. The surface went quiet. The task group reformed formation speed and continued operations, because the war was not slowing for grief. But sailors aboard Task Group 38.3 would later describe a haunting empty patch of sea, the rectangular void in the formation where Princeton should have been, as they accelerated to battle speed again. One ship gone. 200 Birmingham dead. A carrier's existence wiped in a single afternoon. When Task Group 38.3 accelerated back to strike coordination speed, Princeton was no longer a column element. Her position in the grid was simply blank. Operational signals did not pause. The carrier war machine did not slow. Strike group leaders were still coordinating raids against Clark Field and air bases around Manila. Lexington and Essex had to maintain tempo. In the radio logs, Princeton's absence was handled like an entry being deleted, not like a ship dying. There are surviving communications where she is referred to in the past tense before the scuttling even finishes, because operationally she had already left the system. After the battle, Board of Inquiry notes, deck logs, and narrative summaries all used technical language. The ship sank after internal explosions rendered further salvage impossible. Bureau of Ships phrasing was clinical, loss due to conflagration and subsequent magazine detonation. But those who watched her die didn't see a ship sinking. They saw a ship dissolve, cavity by cavity, until the ocean pushed into spaces where structure no longer existed. And here is where the Princeton case still disturbs naval historians. The physical process of her disappearance doesn't map neatly onto the vocabulary the Navy had available. The language of fire, explosion, and hull compromise doesn't fully capture what happened when the torpedo magazine went off, because from that moment forward, Princeton's interior architecture stopped being a coherent thing. Princeton's after-action casualty numbers include not only her own dead, but those from USS Birmingham. That wound, the wound inflicted on the rescuer, is arguably the most painful part. Princeton's death killed her nearest ally. It changed the physics of this single narrative from carrier lost under air attack to carrier becomes a weapon against her own side. That inversion, that logic-breaking twist in how combat effects manifest, is why naval scholars often bracket Princeton in her own category. There is an eerie sentence in one later oral history deposit, from a Birmingham seaman's recollection. It wasn't that she sank. It was that she was not there anymore. That line recurs. Not sunk. Gone. This rhetorical discomfort is important because it reveals something about how sailors process trauma. Ships are not supposed to bleed away into absence. They are supposed to break, roll, heal, take on water, and slide under. Princeton did not behave like a ship in her last 2 hours. She behaved like a shell being subtracted from reality by internal combustion. The wreck would never be located, photographed, or confirmed. Princeton's remains never became a mapped Pacific War grave the way Japanese battleships in Surigao Strait or American destroyers off Samar eventually became. The coordinates of her disappearance, 15 degrees 20 foot N, 123 degrees 30 E, were logged. But the seabed below was never ground-truthed. The deep ocean there is jagged, ridge-crossed, sediment-heavy, and the exact dive path her twisted frame took remains unknown. The Navy ultimately framed her loss as one more cost of the frantic speed of the late-war carrier push into the Philippine Arc. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is often taught in broad strokes. Kurita's center force, Halsey racing north, Taffy 3 at Samar fighting against impossible odds. Princeton is sometimes only a footnote in that larger saga, a carrier lost early, before the great narrative of Leyte reaches its cinematic climax. But if you focus on the microscale, on the human experience of ship crews, Princeton is arguably one of the most haunting erasures in the Pacific War. A single dive bomber got through. A single bomb ignited a carrier's core infrastructure in exactly the wrong place. One magazine blast killed the rescuers. Destroyers then had to fire torpedoes into one of their own to put an end to her fire profile. And then, the sea erased her. She is invisible now. Her final position is a set of numbers and a story told mostly in survivor detail, not in wreck photographs or hull surveys. She does not exist in modern sonar maps of the Pacific. That is the quiet horror of USS Princeton. She began the day as a fully armed, fully operational American fleet carrier. 4 hours later, she was a negative space in the formation. A literal absence. And in that absence, the war did not pause. The airstrikes continued. The world's largest naval battle kept unfolding. Princeton's loss became a tragic data point, but for the men who watched her go, it was not simply a loss. It was a disappearance.